The studio was filled with laughter. Johnny Carson was breathless. Then Richard Pryor finished his sentence, and nobody laughed. It was 1977. The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson was in its 15th year, the undisputed king of late-night television. Every weeknight, millions of Americans ended their day watching Johnny behind that wooden desk, delivering his monologue with perfect timing, interviewing the biggest stars, making it all look effortless. Tonight's guest was Richard Pryor. Brilliant, fearless, dangerous in the best possible way. The kind of comedian who made other comedians nervous. The kind of guest who could make Johnny Carson laugh so hard he'd have to take off his glasses and wipe his eyes. And that's exactly what was happening. Richard had been telling a story. Something about a disastrous club gig in Detroit, a broken microphone, and a heckler who turned out to be the club owner's mother. The way Richard told it. The voices, the physical comedy, the perfect timing, had Johnny completely gone. Carson was bent over his desk, one hand pounding the wood, the other clutching his chest. His famous laugh, that distinctive sound that America knew so well, echoed through the studio. Doc Severinsen and the band were grinning. Ed McMahon was shaking with laughter off camera. The audience was in hysterics. Richard paused, letting the laughter build, riding the wave like the master he was. He glanced at Johnny, saw him gasping for breath, and smiled that knowing smile. Then his expression changed. It happened so subtly that most of the audience didn't notice at first. But Johnny did. Even through his laughter, even wiping tears from his eyes, Johnny Carson saw Richard Pryor's face shift from performer to something else. Something real. Richard leaned back in the orange guest chair, his hands settling in his lap. He waited for the laughter to die down naturally. The studio quieted. Johnny composed himself, put his glasses back on, picked up his cue cards. "Richard, that is," Johnny started, ready to transition to the next question. "Johnny," Richard interrupted softly. "Can I tell you something real?" Carson stopped mid-sentence. The entire studio froze. Johnny's hand holding the cue cards lowered slowly. He leaned forward slightly, his entire body language changing from host to friend. "Of course." Richard took a breath. "I almost didn't make it here tonight." The audience was completely silent now. No coughs. No shuffling. Just waiting. "Not because of traffic or a missed flight," Richard continued, his voice steady but carrying weight. "I mean, I almost didn't make it. Period." Johnny didn't move. Didn't interrupt. Just listened. 2 weeks ago," Richard said, "I was in my house in California. Alone. And I was standing in my living room with a gun." The studio seemed to stop breathing. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what was happening to Richard Pryor in 1977. He was at the peak of his career. His comedy albums were legendary. His stand-up performances were selling out theaters. Hollywood wanted him in movies. He was making more money than he'd ever imagined growing up in Peoria, Illinois. But success hadn't fixed anything. It had actually made some things worse. Richard struggled with demons that fame couldn't silence. Addiction. Depression. The weight of being brilliant in a world that wasn't always ready for his brilliance. The pressure of being Richard Pryor, the fearless comedian who could say anything, do anything, make anyone laugh, when some days he could barely get out of bed. He'd been using cocaine heavily. Drinking. Spiraling. The people around him were worried but didn't know how to help. How do you tell someone that talented, that successful, that they need help? 2 weeks before this Tonight Show appearance, Richard had hit bottom. He was alone in his house. A beautiful house in the hills, the kind of place that should have felt like success but just felt empty. He'd been up for 2 days. The cocaine was gone. The alcohol was making everything worse. And Richard found himself standing in his living room, holding a gun, thinking about how easy it would be to make everything stop. He stood there for 20 minutes. Maybe longer. Time didn't work right in that moment. What saved him wasn't some grand realization or spiritual awakening. It was something smaller. Stranger. His phone rang. Richard almost didn't answer it. But some automatic part of his brain made him pick up. It was his daughter. She was 7 years old. She'd convinced her mother to let her call to say goodnight. "Daddy, I saw you on TV today," she said, her voice small and excited. "You were so funny. I told all my friends that's my daddy." Richard couldn't speak. He was holding the gun in one hand and the phone in the other, and his 7-year-old daughter was telling him she was proud of him. "Daddy? Are you there?" "I'm here, baby," Richard managed. "I'm here." They talked for 5 minutes. She told him about school. About a drawing she'd made. About nothing and everything. When she hung up, Richard put the gun down. He called a friend. He got help. He checked himself into treatment, quietly, away from the press and the public. And now, 2 weeks later, sitting on the Tonight Show across from Johnny Carson, he was deciding to tell the truth. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Johnny Carson's face showed everything: shock, concern, compassion. He didn't reach for humor. Didn't try to lighten the moment. He just sat with it. "Richard," Johnny said quietly, "are you okay now?" "I'm working on it," Richard said. "That's all any of us can do, right? Work on it." Johnny nodded slowly. Then he did something he almost never did during interviews. He set his cue cards down on the desk, not just lowered them, but deliberately placed them face down. The cards that contained his questions, his jokes, his safety net. He looked directly at Richard. "What made you decide to tell me this? To tell everyone?" Richard glanced toward the audience, then back at Johnny. "Because I've been thinking a lot about what we do. You and me. Comedians. We make people laugh. That's the job. But sometimes I think we forget that the people laughing need to know we're human too." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I get letters," Richard continued. "Hundreds of them. From people who watch me, who listen to my albums. And some of them, they're from people who are struggling, who are hurting. And they say my comedy helps them. Makes them feel less alone." His voice cracked slightly. "But what kind of man would I be if I let them think I've got it all figured out? If I pretended that being funny means you're not in pain?" Johnny's eyes were glistening. The camera caught it, that rare moment when Johnny Carson, master of composure, was fighting tears on live television. "I wanted to come here tonight," Richard said, "to your show, because you've always been real with me. Behind the scenes, off camera, you've treated me like a person, not just a guest. And I thought, if I'm going to tell the truth, I should tell it to someone who's always been honest with me." Backstage, he made a choice no producer would have ever allowed. Johnny made a decision in that moment. He could transition to commercial. He could change the subject. He could do what television usually does, protect the audience from reality. Instead, he stood up. The audience gasped softly. Johnny never left his desk during interviews. The desk was home base, the center of the show's universe. But Johnny Carson walked around his desk and sat on the front edge of it, closer to Richard. More intimate. Less host and guest. More two men having a conversation. "Richard," Johnny said, "I want to tell you something, and I want everyone here to hear it." He looked out at the studio audience, then back at Richard. "What you just did, telling the truth like that. That takes more courage than any joke you've ever told. And I've seen you tell some pretty brave jokes." A small laugh rippled through the audience. The tension eased slightly, but the seriousness remained. "I don't talk about this much," Johnny continued, "but I understand what you're saying. About the pressure. About the loneliness. About standing in front of millions of people and feeling completely alone." Richard looked surprised. Everyone did. Johnny Carson didn't do vulnerability. Not on camera. "I've had nights," Johnny said, "where I've delivered a perfect monologue, had a great show, said goodnight to millions of people, and then gone home to an empty apartment, and wondered what the hell any of it means. He picked up one of his cue cards from the desk. Held it up. These cards? They're not just jokes and questions. They're armor. They're a script for how to be Johnny Carson. But some nights, I'm not sure who that is when the cameras turn off. The studio was absolutely silent. America was watching Johnny Carson, the king of late night, the master of cool, admit he was human. So when you say you want it to be real, Johnny said, looking directly at Richard, I want you to know that I see you. Not Richard Pryor the comedian. You. The man. And I'm glad you're still here. Richard's face crumpled. Tears started streaming down his cheeks. He didn't wipe them away. Johnny reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a handkerchief. A simple white handkerchief, the kind men carried in the 1970s. He handed it to Richard. Richard took it, held it for a moment without using it, then looked at Johnny with a mixture of gratitude and pain. Thank you, Richard whispered. But this was the moment no one in the studio, nor anyone at home, ever saw coming. Johnny turned to Doc Severinsen and the band. He made a small gesture, a gentle wave of his hand. Doc understood immediately. He lifted his trumpet and began to play. Softly. Just a simple melody. Nothing showy. Just beautiful. The music filled the studio like a blanket. Warm. Safe. Johnny sat down in Ed McMahon's chair, the sidekick's seat, next to Richard. Equal level. No desk between them. Tell me about your daughter, Johnny said quietly. Richard smiled through his tears. She's 7. Smartest kid you ever met. Funny, too. Gets that from her mother. I doubt that, Johnny said with a gentle smile. Richard laughed, a real laugh, small and genuine. She wants to be a teacher. She's 7 years old, and she's already decided. She wants to help kids. She sounds like she's already helping people, Johnny said. She helped you. Richard nodded, unable to speak for a moment. They sat there for what felt like a long time but was probably only 30 seconds. 2 comedians. 2 men. The camera stayed on them, but it felt less like television and more like a moment that just happened to be witnessed. Finally, Johnny stood up. He took the handkerchief from Richard, who had finally used it to wipe his eyes, and folded it carefully. Then he placed it in Richard's jacket pocket. Keep it, Johnny said. And when you have a bad night, and you will have bad nights, we all do, I want you to pull that out and remember that you told the truth tonight. And that it mattered. The audience erupted. Standing ovation. But it wasn't the usual excited applause. It was deeper. Grateful. The kind of applause that says thank you for letting us be human with you. Doc brought the band in fuller. The music swelled. Johnny walked back to his desk, and as he did, he put his hand on Richard's shoulder, just a brief touch, but the camera caught it. They didn't do the rest of the interview. Johnny simply looked into the camera and said, We're going to take a break. When we come back, Richard's going to stay with us and we're just going to talk. No questions. No cards. Just talk. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. After the commercial break, they did exactly that. Johnny and Richard talked for another 20 minutes, about comedy, about life, about being human. Some of it was funny. Some of it was profound. All of it was real. The handkerchief Johnny gave Richard that night became something Richard carried for years. On bad days. During performances. A reminder that he told the truth and survived it. Johnny kept the cue cards from that interview in a glass frame in his office. Face down. Just like he placed them that night. A reminder that sometimes the best television happens when you throw away the script. Years later, when Johnny retired, Richard sent him a letter. It was short. You saved my life that night. Not with what you said. With how you listened. Thank you for seeing me. Johnny framed that letter next to the cue cards. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. That night changed how America saw both men. Richard Pryor, the fearless comedian who admitted he was scared. Johnny Carson, the cool professional who chose compassion over performance. Two men who made millions laugh by finally letting them cry. The handkerchief is still in Richard's daughter's possession. She keeps it in the same pocket her father did.